what normally happens is when your stress becomes so high and you're really at that tipping point, normally what we do is we utilize stuff to reduce our stress. So we might do things like, go out for lunch, go to restaurants, take annual leave, go to the gym. And normally that's what happens. You get stressed out in your life. You do all these things to release the stress so that you can handle more stress in your life. Does that make sense? So if you can imagine this as an example of stress and you pop it into your bucket of what you can handle, if you're sitting out quite empty, just came back from a holiday, someone gave you $1,000, dinner's cooked, everything's done, your kids are in a good mood, and then this big stress came, you might actually be able to handle it, believe it or not. You'll be able to handle it and then some more, because you've done so much in your life that you've removed all of the stuff. You're not holding on to anything. So what happens here, the higher you get up, Tanti, and you're onto it, the first thing that affects us, the first sign that you're at that tipping point, is that your perception becomes really skewed. Your view of the world changes because you only have this much space to handle stress. Remember, stress is all taken up, so you've only got this much free space. So when you've got this much free space, unless the world stress is going to fit into this space, you're not going to want to know about it. You will have your short fuse, because what's a small deal will become a really big deal because you don't have the space to deal with it. And so that's the first thing that happens, where what's a small deal will become a really big deal to you very quickly on everything. And the second sign is that once things become a big deal, you'll stop becoming compassionate. You'll start losing your sense of empathy. You actually won't care what people think anymore, because guess what, Tanti, you've only got this much stress that you can handle in your life. So if the stress the person's bringing to you can't fit into this little space, tiny weeny here, you don't want to know about it. In fact, you might react, you might get angry, you might lash out, you might scream and shout, you might say things that you regret. Not because you're angry, but because your bandwidth is very minimal. You actually don't have the space because you haven't been releasing all the stresses in your life. It's just all building up. And when that happens to you over a long period of time, when you're just sitting on that edge for like 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, right? There's a bit of a stress release, but it's not enough. So you're just sitting right on that top. The last step happens, the last sign, which is you start to become really, really focused, right? We call it fixations, where you just focus on what's wrong. And that's all that, but you don't want to know about anything else. Your focus is not anywhere else. It's what we call, and I've got it here. Let me bring up, there we go. You become ultra fixated and what we call tunnel vision. All you can see is just that problem. I'm so stressed. I'm so upset. If only this assignment could get done. If only my husband just did the laundry. If only my children didn't give me a hard time. If only I didn't have to go to work. So you start fixating on those particular problems. So what happens is you start thinking, hold on. You start having this tunnel vision. You start, everything seems like it's a problem. And then all of a sudden, that's when you've got step one. If you start realizing that you're making a big deal out of things that you know that you normally don't make a big deal, that's your sign that you're heading there. If you are less compassionate to people, it's not because you're not a good Muslim. It's not because you're being, no rahmah because, shaitan is getting to you. Far from it. The reality is you just don't have space. If you are relieved of those other stresses, you would likely become that compassionate person that you are. And then once that happens over a long time, your vision starts to become so narrow, right? And so it becomes really hard to be able to do things. How do you get out of that situation? When somebody is so stressed out, what do? Well, the first thing, you never tell them to stop stressing. If someone says, oh, I'm so stressed out, and you say, oh, don't worry about it. Oh, I'm so anxious. Don't worry about it. That is the worst thing you can tell somebody, right? Because if the person didn't have to stress, they wouldn't stress. That's what we need to understand. The fact they're saying, I'm so stressed out, I'm so upset, if they had a way to make themselves not upset, they would, right? If they had a way to reduce their stress, they would. But it's because they can't do that, they're coming to you. So I don't tell people not to stress out. If they're stressed, I say, that's all right. I can see that you're stressed out. What we need to do is go back to those 3 signs and reverse them. That is the quickest way to get out of stress. So if you remember what they were, the first one is that when you make a big deal out of things that are usually small for you, okay? Second one is that you become very, you lose your compassion. And the third one is that you're focused. You become too focused on a very narrow place. So the step 1, and I'll bring it up here, I think it's in my next one. You need to remember that even though you're teetering at the top, at the end of the day, you're still standing. You're still healthy. Well, I don't know if you're healthy, to be honest, but you're standing, you're functioning, you're here, and you're doing something in your life that's helping you to stand here today. And we all have them. We have these little rituals that we have, religious or otherwise. They don't have to be particularly religious. They don't have to be expensive. But we have these rituals that we have to increase the focus in our life. And that's what we need to do. If someone has a very narrow focus, you need to broaden their focus, right? That's this first step, broaden. And how do you do that? Without taking whatever issue that you're complaining about or that's a problem in your life, you need to accept it. It is what it is. Don't minimize it. Don't try and say, oh, don't worry about it. Oh, this is a test. Oh, this. You feel awful about it. It's probably awful. Okay, that's fine. But what we try and do is increase and put things into your life to give you some perspective. Open the focus so that thing, even though the size hasn't changed, because your focus has changed, it doesn't become as much of a big deal anymore, if that makes sense. So we broaden. How do you broaden someone's focus? If you go back to that bucket of stress that we were talking about, if you're sitting here, instead of reducing your stress, instead of working on all the stress here, I try and increase your capacity to handle stress. Let's try and increase how much stress you can take. And the way you can increase the space is by putting in these buffers or rituals in your life. So for example, you can imagine let me tell you about my life. There are some rituals that I do in my life to help me just keep functioning. I've been doing it for the last 18 months. Sometimes I change, sometimes I don't. So for example, I work literally in front of a laptop screen. And so at the end, for 8 to 10 hours a day, I'm usually here. And so what I do at the end of my day is I literally go to my screen and I get it and I just shut my screen. And that ritual of just closing my screen signifies that's the end of my workday. So it's just that, and that's a buffer. So that's something to protect me. So when I walk out of the room, closing the door, I tell myself my work is shut, right? Now, I may come back later in the night to write a report or to do something, but the point is I've closed it off. I've made that point of saying enough is enough. It's time for me to move on to something else. And so we all have these little things in our life. Maybe you go on a walk. Maybe you've taken a new hobby. Maybe there's a puzzle that you like. Whatever it is, there are rituals that we all have